Now, ng content has even more features to offer. For example, let's say that we don't want to have this icon class on a span outside of this button's template here. So we might prefer to have this span with this icon class in our button components template. And we might want to wrap that around ng content. Now, of course, we could do that and still use it in the places where we use the button to make this icon here selectable. But if we do that, we of course end up with some duplication. If I now inspect the logout button, you see that in there we have that icon span, which includes another span with the class icon inside of it, which is an unnecessary duplication. For situations like this, you can offer another feature provided by Angular. Instead of adding that class here in the place where you use the button component, you can use the special ng project as attribute, which is supported by Angular, as you can tell by the prefix, and you can add it on any element that's used anywhere where you're using content projection, and it allows you to define a selector that can then be matched from inside the component where you're trying to project this content into. So here I'm trying to project this icon into my button component, and I can, for example, project this through the icon selector. So not the class icon with a dot, but the element selector, so to say. Now I'm not using icon as a HTML element, I'm just setting it for the ng project as property here. Now the effect of that is that in the button component where I'm selecting content, I can now select content that has the element icon, even though I'm never using that element, because I'm using this ng project as attribute. So that simply works together with ng content, which therefore allows me to now use any selector of my choice. And I can of course now also go to the new ticket component, and there on this span, instead of using this class here, we can also use ng project as and use icon like this. And that will then be picked up by the select property on ng content in the button component. And if we save everything, it'll still work as before, but now we don't have that unnecessary wrapping. We still have a span in a span, but we only have one span with the class icon. And before that, we had two spans with that, which was unnecessary. And that's therefore another feature you should be aware of. Now, yet another ng content feature you should be aware of is that you can use it to define some fallback content. For example, if you had some fallback icon that should be used if no specific icon is defined, you can wrap ng content around that fallback content. Now here I'm getting an error because this is actually a pretty new feature, and at the point of time where I'm recording this, it is supported by the latest Angular version, but the Angular language server, which provides that IDE support, doesn't know about that yet. When you're following along with the latest version, this error likely won't show up anymore. But here I'm getting an error that we can't put any content between ng content, because that is indeed the case with older Angular versions. But with the latest versions, this is supported. And it's now this content that would be output if ng content would fail to select content. Which would happen if I remove this span here in the place where the button component is used. If I remove it, there of course is nothing to select for ng content, and it would then output this fallback content instead. So if I save this, you see I still have this icon here in the logout button, but that's now coming from my fallback that's defined here. If I would define a couple of X's here, we would see those instead. Now here, I'll go back to that and go back to actually defining that span here in the header component, because I don't want to have this error here all the time, even though it's not really an error, as I explained, but to also not see it in my IDE, I'll go back to the version without the fallback content, but of course you should know about this feature, which is why I showed it to you. So now that we added a bunch of components and we played around with ngContent quite a bit, there is another reusable component I want to add to this application. And that's a component that should deal with those inputs. Because again here, we have a similar shape of markup which we're reusing. Now of course, we're only using it in 2 places, and you definitely don't need to start creating components for every piece of markup that looks similar. But since we're in a course and for practice purposes, and to also dive into some other more advanced Angular features, I will create yet another reusable component for these controls here, which I have in my form. And therefore, I'll again generate a new component in that shared folder, which I'll name control, because it should be a form control in the end. It should be a component that outputs some form element. Now I forgot to add skip tests, which is why I have this test file here, which I'll remove. And I'll now work on this control component. And my idea with that component is that we grab such a paragraph, which contains a label and an input or a text area. And we copy that, and we use that as a template in the control component template HTML file. But of course now both the label text as well as the input is dynamic and should be settable from outside to make this control component reusable. Now for the label, I'll use an input. We could also use ngContent and select different things, but to mix things up, and since it's just a short, simple string, I'll use an input here, but either approach would be fine. So here in the control component class, we can and should register an input either with @input, as you learned, or through the input function, which is what I'll use here. And I'll name my input label, and then call that input function. And actually, this should be a required input where I'll get a string. And then in the control component template, instead of outputting the hard-coded text title, I want to use string interpolation and output my label input value here. And since I'm using the input function, it's a signal, and I need to add those parentheses. If I would use the @input decorator, you would not add them, but with signals you need them. But what about this input element here now? It has a name and an ID, and it might receive even more input-specific attributes in the future. Therefore, of course, we could start accepting them all as inputs here, but we would potentially end up with a pretty long list of inputs. And whenever we wanted to make a new attribute of this input element configurable, we would have to add a new input to the component. In addition, it's not always an input, which I want to output here. Instead, I also have a text area here. So that therefore screams for ngContent here in the control component. Because ngContent allows us to insert any kind of markup here into this component from inside the place where we're using this component. However, I actually want to be a bit restrictive regarding what can be inserted here, and I'll use select for that. Because you cannot just use this select property on ngContent if you have multiple ngContents, though that is a common use case, but you can also use it to be, well, selective about which kind of content can be projected into one of your components. To make sure that it's not used in an incorrect way, or that it at least doesn't work then. So here I want to select input elements and text area elements. And that is new. You can specify multiple selectors here, separated by a comma. And here I have multiple element selectors. You could, by the way, do something similar for component selectors. Here, if we maybe also want to support anchor tags with app button on them, we could add a comma and add this selector here to the list of selectors. So for component selectors and for ng-content select, you can specify multiple selectors by separating them with a comma. And I'll leave that selector list here for my button component, even though I don't use any anchor tags with app button in this application, just so that you see that you can also have lists of selectors here. But back to the control component, I'm now using this feature to make sure that only inputs or text areas are selected, and any other content doesn't end up in this template. Well, and with that, we can now use this control component. We can go to the new ticket component HTML file and replace this paragraph here with app-control, also for the closing tag. And now we must import this control component to make it available here. And we also must set this label property. And since I want to set it to a string value here, I'll not use square brackets because I don't need the result of some dynamic TypeScript expression here. Instead, I'll just set this to a label of title. And we can and should now remove that label here because we don't need it anymore. I will keep the input though with all its settings. Well, and it's now the same for the text area. I'll replace this paragraph with app control and set the label property to request. Also replace the closing paragraph and get rid of that label here, but keep the text area. And with that, if you save that and you go back, you'll see the same form as before, but it's now rendered with help of our custom app control component, as you can see if you inspect the markup. And in there we got this paragraph and then that label and that input.